Let's start with the moment when a small town realized it had been lying to itself for years. Brainerd, Minnesota. October 1969. Population just over 10,000. A place where people recognize trucks before they recognize faces, where nothing truly disappears, and where the worst crimes usually involve a bar fight or a stolen rifle. This was not a town prepared for what was about to surface along the Pine River Access Road. At 6:18 a.m., a sanitation worker named Lowell Kettering spotted something near the tree line while checking illegal dumping sites. At first glance, it looked like discarded clothing tangled in brush, which was common enough after weekends. What made him stop wasn't the sight, but the way the fabric was folded, almost arranged, as if someone had taken time with it. When Lowell stepped closer, he realized the clothes were still being worn. The body was female, partially concealed by leaves and soil, but positioned deliberately, not thrown, not rushed. The damage was immediately obvious, not chaotic, not animal-related, but systematic, as if the killer had worked with purpose instead of rage. The face had been altered enough to complicate recognition, yet the rest of the body showed no signs of random violence, which made the scene even more unsettling for responding officers. By 7:02 a.m., Sheriff Weldon Rusk arrived and understood something was deeply wrong. This was not a crime of opportunity. This was a crime of method. The victim was later identified as Elaine Cutter, 23 years old, a waitress at a roadside diner just outside town, last seen finishing a late shift 3 nights earlier. She lived alone, worked nights, and had no immediate family in Brainerd. To the town, she was familiar but invisible, the kind of person everyone recognized but no one truly knew. The initial examination raised uncomfortable questions. There were no defensive wounds suggesting a struggle at the site, no signs of sexual assault, and no obvious murder weapon left behind. What stood out instead were traces that didn't belong in the woods. Faint flecks of industrial enamel, microscopic abrasive residue embedded in fabric seams, and an odd consistency in the way tissue damage appeared, controlled rather than frenzied. Sheriff Rusk had seen violent scenes before, but this one didn't behave like violence. It behaved like work. By noon, the story spread through Brainerd in fragments. A girl was found. It was bad. It was ugly. Details traveled faster than facts, and by nightfall, the town had already decided on its explanation. Someone passing through, a drifter, a highway predator, the kind of monster that comes from somewhere else and leaves just as quickly. That explanation was comforting. It was also wrong, because the killer hadn't come to Brainerd to hunt. He had come to work. To understand what happened to Elaine Cutter, investigators had to look backward, not just days or weeks, but years. This wasn't the first time a woman disappeared quietly in a small Midwestern town. It was simply the first time the body couldn't be ignored. Over the previous 7 years, at least 4 women across Minnesota and neighboring states had vanished under circumstances that never escalated beyond missing person notes. A hitchhiker who never arrived. A seasonal worker who stopped calling home. A motel clerk who quit without notice and was never heard from again. No bodies, no crime scenes, no headlines. Elaine's death changed that because her body was meant to be found. Not discovered by accident, but placed in a way that guaranteed attention without revealing everything. Whoever did this wanted recognition without identification, exposure without clarity, fear without a face to attach it to. That contradiction would become the defining feature of the case. At the center of this emerging pattern, though no one realized it yet, was a man named Thaddeus Miro. Most people called him Tad. He was 39 years old in 1969, dark-haired, soft-spoken, with a surname that never quite placed him. Southern European roots, possibly Italian or Spanish, depending on who you asked, but nothing that made him stand out in the Midwest. He worked contract jobs repairing storefront signage, window frames, light boxes, and roadside advertising structures, the kind of work that took him through dozens of small towns without ever tying him to one. He arrived, worked, and left. No permanent address, no fixed schedule, no reason to remember him. What made Tad Miro dangerous wasn't violence, but access. He moved through towns as a service provider, welcomed by business owners, trusted with keys, allowed into back rooms and storage spaces. He carried tools that explained cuts, abrasions, residue, and solvents. He worked late hours when streets were empty and questions were rare. And he paid attention. He noticed which women worked nights, which ones walked home alone, which ones didn't have people waiting for them. He didn't rush. He didn't stalk openly. He simply let routine do the work for him. Elaine Cutter was not his first victim. She was simply the first one he allowed the world to see. The autopsy confirmed what Sheriff Rusk already suspected. The injuries were not impulsive, not expressive, not driven by emotion. They were corrective, as if the killer had tried to erase something specific while preserving the rest. The medical examiner noted that the alterations complicated identification, but stopped just short of complete destruction, a balance that suggested planning rather than panic. More importantly, the examiner found no trace of a struggle and no signs that the crime scene was the location of death. Elaine had been killed somewhere else, transported, prepared, then placed. That single conclusion shifted the entire investigation. This meant the killer had time, privacy, and control, and that ruled out most of the theories Brainerd wanted to believe. Within 48 hours, the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension was notified. A quiet request for assistance went out, and a state investigator named Orrin Dalka began reviewing older missing person files that suddenly felt less isolated. The similarities weren't obvious yet, but they existed in the margins, in timelines, locations, and occupations. Women who disappeared without struggle, women who left behind few witnesses, women who were easy to forget. What connected them wasn't who they were, but how little resistance the world offered when they vanished. As for Tad Miro, he had already left Brainerd by the time Elaine's body was found. A job completed, a town stirred, a pattern advanced. He drove south with tools rattling in the back of his van, radio low, hands steady on the wheel, knowing that attention had finally arrived, but confident that attention without understanding was harmless. For years, he had relied on one truth, a truth that had never failed him. Small towns look outward for monsters. They almost never look at the men who quietly pass through, fix what's broken, and leave everything else exactly the way it was. And for now, that truth was still protecting him. Before Elaine Cutter became a name in police reports and local headlines, there was another woman whose disappearance never reached the news at all. No body, no crime scene, no investigation that lasted longer than a few days. Her name was Roseanne Ibarra, and in 1963, she vanished without leaving anything behind that anyone thought was worth chasing. Roseanne was 27 years old and worked seasonal shifts at roadside cafes along Highway 210, moving between towns when the money dried up or the work became unbearable. She didn't stay anywhere long enough to build roots, didn't keep in touch with family consistently, and in the eyes of law enforcement at the time, she was transient, unreliable, and difficult to classify, which meant her disappearance fit neatly into a category that rarely received resources. Thaddeus Tad Miro met her the way he met most of his victims, not through pursuit, but through proximity. He had been hired to repair a damaged neon sign at a diner where Roseanne worked night shifts. Over several evenings, he became a familiar presence, a quiet man who ordered coffee, fixed wiring, and kept mostly to himself. He listened far more than he spoke, learning her routines, her frustrations, and the fact that she walked back to a rented room behind the diner after midnight. Tad did not rush. He never rushed. On the fourth night, he offered her a ride, explaining that his van was already heading in the same direction and that the road wasn't safe at that hour. It wasn't a calculated pickup line or a sudden move, just a practical suggestion that felt reasonable in the moment. Roseanne accepted, not because she trusted him deeply, but because he had become part of the environment, a worker who blended into the background. The place where Roseanne died was not remote in the way people imagine crime scenes. It was a storage building behind a closed hardware store, a location Tad had access to because of a separate sign repair contract scheduled for the following morning. The space offered privacy, light, and time, which were the only things he required. What happened there was controlled, methodical, and quiet, carried out without panic or visible rage. The killing itself was not elaborate. Tad relied on restraint, positioning, and pressure rather than weapons, understanding exactly how to render someone unconscious without triggering obvious trauma. What came afterward was where his true intention revealed itself. He altered her body carefully, not to satisfy impulse, but to complicate recognition and remove features that would make identification easy if she were ever found. This was not mutilation for shock, but erasure for practicality. Roseanne was never reported missing in a way that mattered. Her employer assumed she had quit. The motel owner cleared out her room and reused it within days. A single note entered into a county file listed her as left area, no forwarding information. That was the end of it. For Tad, it was confirmation. He had proven that a person could be removed entirely if no one insisted on their presence. What followed over the next several years was refinement, not escalation. Tad didn't increase frequency rapidly or repeat the same scenario. Each killing served as a test, a way to adjust technique and risk. He chose women whose routines offered predictability and whose absence would generate confusion rather than urgency. A motel desk clerk who worked alone at night, a traveling sales assistant between towns, a single mother working temporary shifts who rarely spoke to neighbors. Each killing was different in approach, location, and circumstance, but unified by a common result: delayed recognition, complicated identification, and minimal investigation. Tad understood something that most killers never grasped, which was that law enforcement reacts to clarity, not chaos. Confusing cases slow response. Uncertain victims generate hesitation. By 1966, Tad had killed at least 4 women across Minnesota, Iowa, and northern Wisconsin. None of the cases were officially connected. 2 bodies were never found. One set of remains was misidentified. Another was written off as accidental exposure. He traveled constantly, following sign repair contracts, replacing broken storefronts and flickering lights, leaving behind towns that remembered him only as the guy with the van. His tools explained marks. His materials explained residue. His schedule explained absence. Nothing about him demanded scrutiny. Internally, Tad did not view himself as reckless or cruel. He believed he was precise. He believed he was correcting imbalance, removing individuals who already lived on the edge of society, whose disappearance would cause disruption, but not collapse. This belief allowed him to operate without visible emotional response, treating each act as a task completed rather than a transgression committed. He did not keep trophies in the traditional sense. There were no photographs, no journals confessing desire or compulsion. Instead, he kept fragments of practicality: a scarf that had proven useful, an ID card that helped him understand paperwork systems, a purse that revealed how little documentation some people carried. These items were stored not as souvenirs, but as reference material, a private archive of lessons learned. This approach made him dangerous. There was no dramatic signature, no ritual repeated for recognition, only a quiet consistency that made cases difficult to connect. When one woman vanished, it felt isolated. When another did, it felt coincidental. There was no obvious line to draw between them until Elaine Cutter's body appeared in Brainerd, arranged deliberately, forcing the system to look at something it could no longer ignore. Elaine's murder marked a shift in Tad's behavior, not because he lost control, but because he adjusted strategy. He understood that completely invisible crimes eventually risk being erased entirely, even from his own internal record. Leaving a body, altered but visible, created a controlled disturbance, a way to introduce fear without exposing method. It was a calculated risk, one he believed he could manage. When investigators later reviewed Tad's movements from the early 1960s, they would notice a pattern that seemed insignificant at first. His contracts followed similar routes, often revisiting towns after several years, always arriving during periods when young women worked late shifts and public spaces were understaffed. His presence aligned with disappearances that were never treated as crimes until hindsight reframed them. At the time, though, none of this existed as a cohesive picture. To law enforcement in 1963, Roseanne Ibarra was simply gone. To Tad Miro, she was proof that the system worked exactly as he believed it did. And to Brainerd, Minnesota, in 1969, Elaine Cutter would become the moment when that belief finally began to collapse. After Roseanne Ibarra disappeared without consequence, Thaddeus Miro understood something fundamental about the world he was operating in. Violence alone did not create attention. Visibility did. As long as a death could be mistaken for confusion, coincidence, or bad luck, the system would hesitate, and hesitation was safety. Over the next several years, he refined this understanding into practice, committing a series of murders that looked nothing alike on the surface, yet slowly built a hidden structure beneath them. The second confirmed victim came in 1964 near Winona, Minnesota. Her name was Judith Halverson, a night clerk at a small riverfront motel that rarely saw guests after midnight. Tad was in town repairing illuminated signage along the highway, and his presence at the motel was unremarkable, the kind of temporary worker who blended seamlessly into late-night routines. Judith was found dead in a locked supply room behind the front desk, and the scene initially suggested accidental exposure. A faulty heater, poor ventilation, and exhaustion created a plausible explanation, and the case was closed within days. What investigators didn't notice was the precision. The heater had been repositioned deliberately, airflow redirected in a way that required familiarity with enclosed spaces and mechanical systems. Judith's body showed no struggle, no panic, only controlled placement. There was no mutilation, no visible attempt to shock, because this was not a message, it was an experiment. Tad wanted to know how much manipulation was possible without triggering investigation. The third victim was found a year later in Decorah, Iowa, and the circumstances were entirely different. Her name was Linda Paxton, a traveling cosmetics representative staying in a rented room above a closed storefront. Tad encountered her while repairing a cracked display window nearby. This time, he used timing rather than location, entering the building during hours when surrounding businesses were closed and sound carried poorly. Linda's death was ruled a fall, combined with head trauma, an accident caused by poor lighting and a narrow staircase. The alteration came afterward. Tad deliberately changed identifying features just enough to delay confirmation, forcing authorities to rely on paperwork and secondhand descriptions. The delay worked. By the time identification was complete, no meaningful investigative energy remained. Another isolated incident, another case closed without connection. By 1966, Tad had developed confidence in variation. Each murder was different by design. Different towns, different circumstances, different causes listed on official documents. What remained consistent were the small details no one compared. Traces of industrial materials, tool-related abrasions, fibers from protective covers used in signage work. Individually, these details meant nothing. Collectively, they formed a signature hidden beneath the noise. The fourth victim, Maribel Cruz, disappeared in Superior, Wisconsin, after finishing a late shift at a cannery office. Her body was never found. Instead, personal belongings surfaced weeks later near a rail yard, arranged neatly inside a discarded crate. Investigators assumed theft or abandonment. No one considered that the placement itself was intentional, a controlled release of evidence designed to confuse rather than inform. Tad had learned that partial information was more destabilizing than none at all. Each killing taught him something new. Which towns responded quickly? Which coroners questioned paperwork? Which police departments lacked resources to pursue complex cases? He adjusted accordingly, choosing routes that passed through jurisdictions unlikely to coordinate with one another. State lines became shields. paperwork delays became weapons. By the time Elaine Cutter's body appeared in Brainerd in 1969, Tad had already killed at least 5 women, possibly more. The difference was not impulse or escalation, but presentation. Elaine's body was altered in a way that demanded attention while still resisting identification, a deliberate contradiction that forced law enforcement to confront the possibility of design rather than coincidence. For the first time, investigators began comparing notes across counties, though slowly and reluctantly. A Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension analyst noticed similarities in missing person timelines. An Iowa deputy recalled an old case that never sat right. A Wisconsin coroner remembered residue he couldn't explain. None of these observations were conclusive, but together they formed the earliest outline of a pattern. At the center of that pattern, though still unnamed, was a man who never stayed long enough to be questioned and never acted in ways that demanded memory. Tad Miro understood that true anonymity came not from hiding, but from usefulness. He fixed broken signs. He restored visibility for businesses. He arrived as a solution and left as an absence. What law enforcement didn't yet understand was that the killer was not adapting out of fear. He was refining out of confidence. Every variation, every altered method, every different outcome was intentional, a way to build a system resilient to scrutiny. He believed that as long as no 2 deaths looked alike, no one would ever look beneath the surface. But systems create structure, and structure creates patterns, even when disguised. By late 1969, those patterns had begun to whisper across state lines, quiet enough to be ignored, but persistent enough to draw the attention of someone trained to listen. The question was no longer whether these deaths were connected, but how long it would take for the right person to see what had been hiding in plain sight. And once that happened, variation would no longer protect him. The first real mistake law enforcement had made was assuming that if a killer existed, he would announce himself. By late 1969, that assumption was beginning to collapse. Elaine Cutter's death had forced attention where none existed before, and with attention came comparison, something Tad Miro had spent years actively preventing. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension quietly assigned Detective Orrin Dalka to review the Brainerd case, not because it was clearly connected to anything else, but because it didn't behave like a standalone crime. Dalka was methodical by nature, a second-generation Czech-American investigator who distrusted dramatic theories and preferred systems, timelines, and logistics. He didn't start with motive or psychology. He started with movement. Dalka requested access to older missing persons files, not just in Minnesota, but in neighboring states, focusing on cases involving women who disappeared near highways, rail lines, or commercial zones. What he noticed almost immediately was not similarity in cause of death, but similarity in timing. Several disappearances aligned with short windows, 2 to 5 days long, periods when outside contractors had been working in town. That was the first crack. The second came when Dalka overlaid service permits, business invoices, and city maintenance logs on a regional map. Town after town showed brief visits from the same type of worker: signage repair, storefront lighting, window framing. The names varied, the companies differed, but one contractor appeared repeatedly under slight variations of paperwork, always staying just long enough to complete work and move on. That contractor was Thaddeus Miro. At this stage, Tad was not a suspect. He was a data point, a recurring presence that didn't belong in a homicide file, which made him interesting. Dalka pulled vehicle registrations, job routes, and motel receipts, building a map that Tad never knew existed. What emerged was a corridor of travel running through Minnesota, Iowa, and Wisconsin, matching the timeline of disappearances with unsettling precision. Still, none of this was proof. Dalka understood the danger of acting too early. A man like this wouldn't panic, wouldn't confess, and wouldn't leave obvious evidence behind. The case would have to be built slowly, piece by piece, with material facts rather than assumptions. Meanwhile, Tad continued working. He noticed more police cars in certain towns, more questions from business owners, but nothing that suggested his name was being spoken aloud. His confidence remained intact, reinforced by years of successful variation. He had never reused a location, never repeated a method, never stayed after a death. What he didn't account for was aggregation. Dalka's next step was forensic, not psychological. He requested reanalysis of trace materials recovered from a lane cutter's clothing and compared them with archived samples from older cases. Individually, the findings were meaningless, but together they told a story. The same industrial enamel type, discontinued in the early 1960s, appeared in 2 cases. A rare abrasive compound used primarily in signage resurfacing appeared in another. Fibers consistent with padded tool bags showed up more than once. This was no longer coincidence. The materials pointed to a trade, and trades have tools, roots, and habits. Dalka expanded the investigation quietly, looping in state agencies under the guise of administrative review. He avoided public announcements and media attention, understanding that pressure could cause a careful offender to vanish permanently. Instead, he built leverage, following supply chains, distributors, and specialty vendors that sold the materials appearing at multiple scenes. One invoice stood out: a bulk purchase of enamel and abrasives shipped to a mobile contractor operating out of a modified panel van, registered under Tad Miro's name. For the first time, Dalka had a tangible thread. The investigation escalated without Tad's knowledge. Police in 3 states began flagging Miro's name internally, not as a suspect, but as a person of interest. Officers were instructed to note his presence, record locations, and collect anything discarded near his work sites. It was a slow net, not a trap, designed to tighten without being felt. Tad sensed none of it. He continued his routines, careful, disciplined, convinced that as long as he didn't change behavior, behavior would not be noticed. He believed correctly for many years that systems fail when people panic. He did not panic. What he didn't understand was that the system had finally learned how to look at him. By early 1970, Dalka had assembled a working theory. The killer was mobile, trade-skilled, method-oriented, and deliberately disguising patterns through variation. This wasn't guesswork. It was deduction built from movement, materials, and absence. The case file now had a name on its cover: Thaddeus Miro. Not yet a charge, not yet an arrest, but no longer invisible. And once a man like Tad is seen, truly seen, the remaining question is never if he will be caught, but how long it will take for the physical proof to surface. Because evidence, like people, eventually leaves traces. And Tad Miro was still moving. By the time Detective Oren Dalka requested a formal warrant, the investigation had already crossed the point of speculation. This was no longer about patterns or probabilities, but about convergence. Roots, materials, timelines, and absences were no longer running parallel. They were intersecting, and every intersection pointed back to the same man who had spent years moving unnoticed between towns. Thaddeus Miro did not live like someone hiding. That was his advantage. He rented modest rooms, paid in cash when possible, kept his van clean, and avoided personal connections that might anchor him to one place. To neighbors and business owners, he was forgettable by design. But forgettable men still leave records, and Dalka had learned to read what wasn't meant to be read together. The warrant did not authorize an arrest. It authorized observation and search. The first target was the van. When state officers intercepted Miro near Duluth, under the pretense of a vehicle safety inspection, he complied calmly, answering questions with the same measured tone he used everywhere. He did not argue, did not rush, and did not appear nervous. His van contained exactly what it was supposed to contain: tools, replacement panels, wiring, abrasives, enamel cans, and padded storage cases. Everything was organized, clean, and professional. What mattered was not what was obvious. It was what didn't belong. Inside a sealed compartment beneath a false floor panel, investigators found folded clothing wrapped in protective sheeting. Not random clothing, but carefully cleaned garments, some altered, some partially disassembled. A scarf that matched a missing person description from Iowa. A blouse with distinctive stitching linked to a Wisconsin department store. Shoes whose wear patterns matched footprints documented years earlier, but never identified. This was not coincidence. It was storage. Dalka ordered the van impounded quietly. Miro was released. For now, the second search was more revealing. Using rental records and supply invoices, investigators identified a long-term storage unit leased under Miro's name on the outskirts of Brainerd, rented years earlier and rarely accessed. The unit appeared unremarkable from the outside, one among hundreds, secured with a standard lock. Inside, the story changed. Boxes were stacked deliberately, each labeled with dates and town names. Inside them were personal effects belonging to multiple women. Purses, identification cards, costume jewelry, handwritten notes, and items too personal to be explained away as abandoned property. Some items had been cleaned, others preserved carefully. All of them represented lives that had stopped abruptly. Forensic teams worked in silence. They didn't need dramatics. The evidence spoke clearly enough. Fibers from multiple cases matched padding from Miro's tool bags. Trace enamel residue aligned with materials found on Elaine Cutter's clothing. More importantly, documents belonging to women reported missing in different states were now located in one place, physically linking cases that had never before shared a room. Dalka finally had what he needed: a system, a collector, a killer. The arrest came 2 days later. No chase, no confrontation. Miro was taken into custody at a diner parking lot in Bemidji, where he had stopped for coffee between jobs. He did not resist. He did not ask why. He simply stood, placed his hands behind his back, and waited. During interrogation, he remained consistent, polite, and controlled. He denied violence. He denied murder. He explained the items as found property, remnants of abandoned jobs, misunderstandings. His story was calm, structured, and incomplete, but it didn't matter anymore. The physical evidence had already outpaced his explanations. Witnesses were located. Business owners confirmed his presence in towns during key windows. Supply vendors verified purchases. Medical examiners re-reviewed older cases with new context, reclassifying causes of death. Elaine Cutter's case anchored the timeline, and from it, the rest of the structure unfolded logically. This was no longer a hunt. It was documentation. The charges followed quickly. Multiple counts of first-degree murder, interstate transport related to homicide, abuse of a corpse, evidence tampering. Each count supported by material facts, not confession. Miro never broke. He never needed to. The system that had protected him for years had simply finished processing him. As news spread, towns along his route began reopening old files, attaching names to disappearances that had once been dismissed. Families were notified, records updated, headstones ordered for people who had never been officially declared dead. What stunned the public was not how violent he was. It was how ordinary he had been. The man who fixed signs, the man who asked for coffee, the man who left town quietly. By the time the trial date was set, there was no doubt left to resolve. Only judgment. And in the final part, the system that Tad Miro had exploited for years would speak back to him, using the same tools he had relied on: records, procedures, and inevitability. The trial of Thaddeus Miro began in the spring of 1971 in a packed courthouse that had never seen anything like this before. Brainerd was not a town accustomed to prolonged legal battles, interstate investigations, or prosecutors flying in from multiple jurisdictions. Yet now it stood at the center of a case that stretched across state lines and nearly a decade of quiet disappearances. The prosecution did not rely on drama. They didn't need to. Their case was built the same way Miro's crimes had been committed, methodically, step by step, supported by logistics rather than emotion. Jurors were shown maps of his work routes, invoices from signage contracts, motel receipts, fuel logs, and supply purchases that aligned precisely with the timelines of disappearances. Each document alone seemed harmless. Together, they formed a structure that could not be dismissed. Then came the physical evidence. Boxes recovered from the storage unit were opened one by one in court. Personal items were identified by family members who had not seen them in years. A scarf, a purse, a pair of shoes, an ID card that had never been returned. Forensic experts explained how fibers, abrasives, and industrial enamel residue connected multiple victims to the same tools, the same van, and the same hands. Medical examiners testified that earlier conclusions had been wrong, that deaths once classified as accidents or natural causes were now clearly the result of controlled homicide. Thaddeus Miro sat through all of it without visible reaction. He did not object. He did not interrupt. He did not look away. When the defense attempted to frame him as a collector of abandoned property or a man misunderstood by coincidence, the argument collapsed under the weight of repetition. Too many towns, too many women, too many identical materials, too many deliberate acts disguised as randomness. This was not coincidence. It was design. When Miro was finally allowed to speak, he declined to offer an explanation. No confession, no apology, no attempt to justify his actions. He simply stated that he believed the evidence was being interpreted incorrectly, and that the system had decided who he was before he was allowed to explain himself. It was the only emotional language he used, and even then, it sounded procedural rather than personal. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. Sentencing followed swiftly. The judge did not raise his voice or dramatize the moment. He spoke in measured terms, outlining the number of victims, the duration of the crimes, and the calculated nature of the acts. He emphasized that this was not a crime of impulse, passion, or mental collapse, but one of sustained intent carried out across years and jurisdictions. The sentence was death, in accordance with Minnesota law at the time, and supported by the scale and severity of the crimes. Thaddeus Miro was condemned to execution. He showed no visible reaction. The execution took place in 1973 at the state penitentiary. There were no witnesses beyond those required by law. No final statement, no request. Miro walked calmly, followed instructions precisely, and remained silent until the end. Those present later described him not as frightened or defiant, but procedural, as if he were simply completing the final step of a process he had understood long before anyone else. The time of death was recorded, paperwork was completed, the system closed the file. In the months that followed, towns along Miro's route continued reopening old records. Missing persons were officially declared dead. Families received confirmation where there had once only been uncertainty. Graves were marked. Names were restored. Brainerd changed quietly. People walked home together more often. Night shifts were adjusted. Strangers were noticed. Not with panic, but with awareness. Detective Orrin Dalka returned to state work and never publicly spoke about the case again. When asked years later how Miro had managed to operate for so long, he gave the same answer every time. He didn't hide, Dalka said. He moved. Thaddeus Miro never became a legend. There were no books written about him in his lifetime. No cult following, no mythology. And that may have been the most fitting end, because his greatest weapon was not brutality or rage, but the assumption that ordinary systems, routines, and small-town trust could never be turned against the people they were meant to protect. In the end, those same systems did exactly that. They saw him, they recorded him, they processed him, and they stopped him.